For any new projects, I would always recommend that you use the SqlDataSource control and not the SqlDataSource control. Link is Microsoft's newer and better technology. The reason you're going to learn about SqlDataSource controls is that you may work on older projects that were created before Link became available. The SqlDataSource control is very similar to the SqlDataSource control, but instead of accessing data via your Link classes, it interacts directly with the database. To begin this lesson, open the Spark project from your Sample Files folder. And open reports.aspx in Design View. Now delete the Details View control if it's still left from the previous lesson. And add a SqlDataSource control from the Data category of the toolbox. Place it just after your SqlDataSource control. And set its ID property to SqlDataSource invoice. Now you'll need to configure the new SqlDataSource control. Open the Quick Tasks menu of the new control and click Configure Data Source. A dialog appears. Click the drop-down menu and select Spark Connection String. The connection string tells the SqlDataSource control how to connect to your database. Visual Studio automatically added Spark connection string to the web.config file when the database was added to the project. Click Next now, and a configuration dialog appears that is very similar to the configuration dialog for the SqlDataSource control. Click the Name drop-down and select Invoice. Some code appears in the Select statement box. This is the automatically generated SQL code that will be sent to the database. Now click Order By, and a sorting dialog appears that is almost identical to the one for the SqlDataSource control. Set the SqlDataSource control to sort by invoice date. And click OK. You'll notice that some more SQL code has been added to sort the results. This SqlDataSource control now does exactly the same thing as the SqlDataSource control on this page. Note that if you clicked Specify a custom SQL statement or stored procedure, you would have to specify custom SQL code or tell your SqlDataSource to use a stored procedure. If you must use a SqlDataSource instead of a SqlDataSource, it is better to use a stored procedure than to specify custom SQL code. Using stored procedures centralizes your SQL code within the database and makes it easier to maintain your code if the database changes. Click Next now, and click Finish. Now let's make use of your new data source control. Open the Quick Tasks menu of the Grid View control and use the Choose Data Source drop-down menu to select SqlDataSource Invoice. When prompted to refresh the fields and keys, click No. If you were to click Yes, you'd lose all of the formatting that you applied earlier in this session. View reports.aspx in your browser now. As you can see, the data is successfully retrieved from the database by your SqlDataSource control. Now click Edit next to one of the records and try to update its values. An error message appears. SqlDataSource controls can't update records unless you manually add SQL code to the control's Update Query property. Close your browser now and use the Quick Tasks menu of the Grid View control to switch back to the Link Data Source control. Then delete SqlDataSource invoice. Close Visual Studio now, saving your changes if prompted. You've now completed Lesson 11.7. Use the SqlDataSource control.